Trey Wallace goes into the portal. Amari Evans goes into the portal. And Penn State at least got something from them. I mean, those were the two best receivers from this past season, and they're in the portal. I mean, the word reset was not used lightly, at least not by me, and I don't think by anybody else. And that's probably a word that you've used to kind of describe how this needed to go. Keandre Lambert-Smith made that decision to move on last cycle, and now it's Amari Evans and Trey Wallace. The common theme here is that here's how Penn State views it, because actions speak louder than words. The guys that are in the wide receiver room are not doing their job, and Marcus Hagans is. Basically, they see it as this. The wide receivers, the veteran wide receivers, are not performing the way that they should, or else they would have moved on from Marcus Hagans. Would they have not?
Yeah, I mean, the wide receiver discourse is just
Well, that's why we're talking about it, right?
Yeah, it's all over the place, and I don't know exactly how I feel about it. I understand the sentiment of fans and people saying the wide receiver room needed a reset. I'm well aware that Amari Evans and Trey Wallace did not have any receptions in the Orange Bowl. They're very aware, completely understand. I don't know if I was on board the complete reset.
Okay.
You know, people like Mekhi Flowers and Tyler Johnson and guys who weren't really seeing playing time. I understand they want to get out and they want to go somewhere where they can play. And honestly, even Amari Evans, he was a bit of a luxury as far as what he was doing at Penn State, which was just being a deep threat. And that's no offense to Amari. He thinks that he can do more. He's going to potentially get that opportunity somewhere else. I think I saw that he's going to visit Syracuse and Texas Tech, so we'll see. But I would have really liked to keep Trey Wallace. And even in the roster reset of this wide receiver room, I still would have liked to have, somebody who had, granted it was, a 16-game season, which kind of skews the stats, but somebody who almost had 50 receptions, someone who had a couple touchdowns and flashed at times. I understand he didn't flash against Ohio State, he didn't flash against Notre Dame, but certainly flashed at times, because the rub on Trey Wallace coming out of school as a high school prospect was that he was a late bloomer. He was somebody who was more focused on basketball for most of his high school career, kind of made the switch to being all in on football a little bit later on, so he was going to need some time to fully develop. I would have liked to keep him, and part of that is because of the talent that he is. The other part of that is that I don't know if I necessarily love the wide receiver room behind him, right? It's not like, defensive end or safety, right? At safety, you have Dejon Lane and Babu Toure, two, who I think are going to be future all-conference guys, or certainly have that potential. Hagans has been recruiting a little bit better. I like Josiah Brown from the last class. I like Peter Gonzalez from the last class. Of course, I mean, all Penn State fans at this point have to have Tyseer Denmark is the number one.
As a breakout, yeah,
on their forehead, because they kind of need him to be that. But I just don't foresee this wide receiver room being completely stacked. And I was kind of working on the wide receiver depth chart, and I understand that Penn State's going to go with a lot of 2 wide receiver looks once again, or more than likely will. But even if that's the case, so you have Kyron Hudson transferred from USC, you have Devontae Ross that transferred from Troy, you have Tyseer Denmark. Let's say those are your top 3 wide receivers. After that, it's Liam Clifford, it's Anthony Ivy, it's a redshirt Peter Gonzalez who is out this entire season, and we don't have confirmation on what that injury is. One can guess it's probably a knee injury from what we have heard. You have Caden Saunders, who was basically out. I know he fielded some punts at some point this year, but was never really healthy this year, and it's somebody who hasn't quite lived up to expectations.
Yeah.
So my point being is that I don't know if there's a KJ Hamler coming, that there's a Jahan Dotson coming, that there's a Chris Godwin coming. And it would feel a little bit different about this roster reset if it felt like, Penn State has some studs coming in. Maybe that happens. Maybe Peter Gonzalez stays healthy and just turns into, a starting level wide receiver right away. Maybe Andrew Olesh, who is 210 pounds, they say, hey, let's not pack 35 pounds on him right away. Let's try to see if we can put him at wide receiver, because he certainly has the athletic numbers to do it. That's going to be my agenda this offseason. Just want to make you aware, Zach. So maybe wide receiver works out. Maybe it doesn't. There's obviously going to be the spring transfer portal period as well, which I assume Penn State's going to be pretty damn aggressive when it comes to wide receivers there. But I would have liked Trey to at least stay for the spring. The same thing that we saw with Keandre Lambert-Smith last year, right? He stayed through the spring and then decided, you know what, I'm out of here. But
there's so many layers that you and I could actually talk about the wide receiver situation going back to the first domino that is Keandre Lambert-Smith and Julian Fleming, and then bringing us back to the present. Unfortunately, we don't have an hour on the show, right? Trying to keep it, between 30 and 40 minutes here. But to sum it all up, I mean, there's so many directions I can take this in. Penn State doesn't need the wide receiver room to be this. They made the national semifinal, for crying out loud, and have won 23 games in 2 seasons with the production that they had at wide receiver. Yes, I would have loved Trey Wallace to be a third option in Penn State's offense, but does Trey Wallace like the idea of that? It's kind of the same thing with Keandre Lambert-Smith. Your offensive coordinator gets fired, and who knows what his relationship with Mike Yurcich was, but I think these the coaches and the wide receivers kind of almost like a business of eval. You kind of at end of the quarter. Well, they have an end of the season evaluation, and I think they're honest with them, and they say, hey, you're going to be competing with Kyron Hudson and Devontae Ross and Tyseer Denmark for volume within this offense. You are not going to be the clear-cut number 1 wide receiver because you couldn't get it done. Yes, against West Virginia and Maryland, that's great. But against Notre Dame and Ohio State, where we needed you to give us something, you did not. And Trey Wallace is probably thinking the same thing. Well, I don't need this. Why should I, move down the depth chart because I wasn't utilized? Who knows how he feels ultimately in the situation? I mean, he had 700 yards. Granted, they played 16 games, but he had over 700 yards, and he would have factored into the offense, but it's kind of the same thing. Keandre Lambert-Smith got a demotion by Julian Fleming coming in and saying, hey, you're going to have to compete with some other guys for playing time. You're not going to be the number 1 X wide receiver anymore. This is going to be a new look offense. And remember, Penn State's just going to be run focused. And that's why I say they don't need an elite wide receiver, at least for 2025, because you have Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen back. You bring in Kyron Hudson and Devontae Ross, who give you specialty skills. Hudson can catch anything you throw at him. He has flypaper hands. He will make any catch that you ask him to. The question is, can he separate? But he can catch anything. He can block like a Julian Fleming. That's what Penn State's looking for there. And then Devontae Ross gives you that speed, gives you that home run threat, makes the safeties respect your passing game enough to give Allen and Singleton some more room in the box. And don't forget, Singleton can catch passes. Katron Allen can catch passes. It is legal to throw the football to running backs. I joked about it at first, but I legitimately think that Andy Kotelnicki's base offense is going to be a wishbone-like formation where you have Singleton, Allen, and some combination of Cam Wallace, Corey Smith, and Quentin Martin, and you're going to run 3 running back sets with 2 tight ends and Khalil Dinkins and Luke Reynolds, Kyron Hudson, Devontae Ross. What's wrong with that? That wins you football games.
I think the question, though, Zach, is right. So with Trey Wallace and Amari Evans, and I know people like to think, right, and Penn State might think this, that Kyron Hudson and Devontae Ross is going to be better than Trey Wallace and Amari Evans. And they might be right on that. But for Penn State to take that next step, and I know I keep teasing this 2025 title favorites thing, but for Penn State to take that next step, right, to not just get to a semifinal, but to win that semifinal and to ultimately win a championship, can you do that with Kyron Hudson and Devontae Ross as your number 1, number 2 wide receivers? And even beyond that, I think the question for me, just knowing that injuries happen, right, that we're going to look at this depth chart and we're going to look at these players, and some of them are going to go down. Abdul Carter was hurt in the Orange Bowl. Kevin Winston Jr. was hurt the entire year. Alonzo Ford, right? Penn State lost a bunch of people throughout the year.
You need depth.
If a Devontae Ross goes down, if a Kyron Hudson goes down, how comfortable do you feel about that wide receiver room? And I understand that it can be, I don't envy Penn State's position of trying to keep the younger guys happy enough that you don't see a total mass exodus from guys you like, but also trying to bring people in. So I think that's kind of the question for Penn State. Is Kyron Hudson and Devontae Ross, even if they stay healthy, are they good enough for Penn State to take that next step, knowing that you are losing Tyler Warren, who is a massive piece to lose?
And that's where Singleton and Allen being back helps. The offensive line, at least a bulk of it, right? Sal Wormley's going off to the NFL, but you get a TJ Shanahan out of the portal. You have all those tight ends. You have Khalil Dinkins. You have Luke Reynolds. Andrew Rapplier is supposed to be back. Joey Schlaffer, I think, surprisingly, has not entered the transfer portal. It's really just been Jerry Cross, right? And I think so there's all this. I don't think people realize how stacked Penn State is at other position groups. It's just wide receiver is such an outlier here, and it's just brought into the spotlight. But Michigan did it for 2023. Oh, Connor Stallions. No. Let's talk about football and X's and O's for a moment. Who did Michigan have? What did they rely on? They relied on elite defense, a solid quarterback in J.J. McCarthy at the time, and Donovan Edwards and Blake Corum, an all-out, all-star offensive line, and Roman Wilson. Can Kyron Hudson be good enough to be comparable to Roman Wilson? I think so. Devontae Ross gives you a deep threat to give you some, just again, force the safeties to respect you. I think so.